interest group. Ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all pay you a very warm welcome and ask you a good big thanks for joining us today. We have people from different regions and also spanning on different disabilities. So we have a good working team that is technical team consisting of Jolly McFly, Judith Hellestein, Naveed Haq, and all of others. So thank you very much for once again for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, this webinar is first in a series which is on a very significant subject, considering the times and the age that we all are living in. And that specifically means the age of COVID-19. This signifies the importance and significance of the accessibility of the digital technologies. And digital technologies have made so many things possible, so many things enable for everyone, which would not have been possible had there been no technologies. So what we are not demanding anything unique. We are not demanding as person with disabilities anything new. We are not demanding anything which is enabled, which is impossible. We are just asking for the digital devices and the digital environments to be made accessible for everyone, because digital technologies, they don't see your physical attributes. They just see how developers made them, how developers create them. So we are just asking to make these environments accessible for everyone. These should be open and friendly to everyone. And we will listen to different perspectives during this webinar. As I said in the beginning, that this is a first webinar in a series of 6 or 7 webinars that we as Accessibility Special Interest Group of Internet Society would organize over the next coming 6 or 7 months. And in this webinar, we will just give an overview of different regions, different countries, and different disabilities. In the series, which would be held in the 1 or 2 webinars in the next months, and you will see the details on the social media as well as on the different platforms that you get the information from. So these would be on specific topics. So what we'll do today is that we have a wonderful speaker, a digital web accessibility expert, David Berman, who would speak on and share his experience with us as a keynote speaker. And then we would have some experience sharing from different people, and from different people with disabilities, as well as from other persons and from different regions. And then we will have a small portion for question answer, which would be very significant, because this would be a portion where our participants would be sharing their views with us. Before I invite our first speaker, I would just like to mention here that we have, thanks to Deaf Talk, that we have 2 wonderful sign language interpreters for our deaf friends. We also have captioner, who is yeah. So we also have the captioning for the hard of hearing, and for anyone else who wants to see that. Yes, it is a technology, and there are certain difficulties which we will combat and we'll try to overcome. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. And if you have any specific comments, or if you want to raise your voice, you would get the time after our speakers are done. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I would first like to ask David Berman, who is the founder and chairman of David Berman Technologies from Canada. He has a very vast experience of working with the governments on making websites accessible for persons with disabilities. So David, would you be able to tell us that how is your experience of working with different governments, how it has been, and how you have found governments receptive to making their digital environments accessible for persons with disabilities?
Absolutely. Shabbir, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this event. Before I get into digital government and the accessibility dividend, I want to explain that I'm wearing a mask. It's a COVID-19 mask. However, it's different than most because it's designed by a double pandemic hero. Sarah Bloomfield, a nurse in northern Michigan, had a coworker who is hard of hearing and who relies on lip reading to be able to communicate. So she designed this mask, which I'm just going to take it off right now. And you'll see, for those who can see, this is a typical mask, but it has a clear plastic window sewn into it where the mouth is. And Sarah designed this originally to help accommodate someone living with a disability. However, of course, we all benefit if we can see each other's mouths when we're wearing masks, because whether we're hard of hearing or whether we're deaf and using sign language, which of course the face is a key part of the communication, everyone finds it easier to understand each other when we can see the emotions and the movements that make up more of the face. And it's another example that when we design for the extremes, everyone benefits. Everyone should be wearing a mask with a clear plastic face so that anyone visual can communicate better. So thank you, Sarah. Now, this principle of designing for the extremes so that everyone benefits is a core of the experience that Shabbir was asking me to comment upon. It's a key principle because, for example, working with the government of Canada, here I am in Ottawa in the morning in the nation's capital of Canada, we were able to drive down the cost of a typical interaction with the National Revenue Agency service from $26 a call every time someone picks up the phone during tax season. It costs $26 to answer the phone. But if someone can self-serve, it only costs 6 cents. And so if we make sure that everyone can self-serve, we actually are able to save millions of dollars. And this type of thinking, what we like to call the accessibility dividend, is that payoff when we do things to help make sure we include everyone. We get benefits for everyone. So I've been working with governments in Mexico and Ireland and Norway and Oman. But when Shabbir and Naveed, thank you so much, when the Internet Society invited me last fall to come to Pakistan, it was actually the biggest opportunity perhaps in my career to leave a legacy of making the world better, of designing a better civilization. Because Pakistan has over 200 million people, fifth largest population in the world, and perhaps 20% living with some sort of disability. Imagine just those with hearing challenges, over 10 million people. So the opportunity to, even if the changes we were making in the fall to help Pakistan fulfill its digital plan, even if it helped just at 1% of those people, we are making so many lives greater. And Shabbir, you were mentioning about the challenges of COVID. I completely agree. And if anything, there's a silver lining that we're experiencing with COVID-19, because suddenly our clients are saying, now we get it. Now that we have to work remotely, now that we can't always be seen or heard or be able to touch, distance learning, distance events are simply a basket of temporary disabilities. And in fact, for my own organization, because we're so accustomed to inclusive communication, we actually found the transition very easy to go from everyone working remote, because it's kind of what we do anyhow. Now, the Canadian government has done a great job. But what I'm also finding is that working with people around the world, we're finding people are quickly stumbling, sometimes leaping forward with things they didn't think they could do. So for example, in higher ed, in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, around the world, we've been getting calls helping figure out how to do distance education. And professors had been saying for years, being pushed, oh, can you put your courses online? Can you make them fully accessible? And they'd say, I don't know how this will take years to do. But suddenly, when they actually had to get it done, poof, suddenly universities, colleges around the world are online, varying levels of accessibility, but they're getting it done. And so people are being pushed to get this stuff done. Here in the federal government in Canada, there's been talk about going to, let's say, to digital signatures instead of ink signatures on documents for a long time. But finally, people of all abilities suddenly realize that they have to be able to sign documents officially at a distance. Digital signatures also just happen to be accessible. And so this is the payoff. So now, there are, of course, political challenges as well during a situation like this one. During the pandemic in the United States, for example, there were people suggesting that, oh, it's hard enough to run society in this new way. How can maybe we should just lower the bar. Maybe we should temporarily turn off the regulations that protect the human rights of people living with disabilities, which is, of course, it's a horrific idea because we know that people living with disabilities are more at risk than the general population, both from a political perspective, where, for example, in the state of Alabama, there was actually direction being given to hospitals to not offer mechanical ventilators to patients who happen to have conditions of retardation or severe dementia or brain injuries. I understand the logic of how they got there, but this is human when it comes to deciding who gets to live. And the response, though, mostly globally, that we're aware of is the opposite. That people are realizing here's an opportunity to make sure everyone remains engaged. We were also talking, one of the nuances we've been dealing with as we talk about return to work strategies is we realize that in the government, as people return to work and people need to wear masks, and how will we handle challenges of colleagues who are hard of hearing or who are blind? For example,
This meeting is being recorded.
we realize that
The recording has stopped.
we realize that wayfinding, public wayfinding, braille on the walls, is actually a public health issue. Why should someone who's blind have to touch something that someone else just touched? Which makes us decide now it's finally the time to leap forward with beacons and QR codes and other ways that we can help people find their way without having to use the old school techniques. And I'm not suggesting for a moment we would replace the systems
This
that work,
meeting is being recorded.
but rather we would augment it with leading edge thinking, with for instance, I was looking at an Android app. I'm holding up my phone, an Android app, which actually allows you to continuously scan the space you're in up to 75 away for any QR codes of a certain nature, which then would continually announce them to anyone who is non-visual. So they know what objects in their periphery, like this QR code on my t-shirt, is available to you to be announced what's in your field of vision. So the key is this. I'm thinking, imagine you were living through a pandemic, but not the current one, but the Spanish flu in the 1910s. Or imagine you were living in the bubonic plague, which wiped out a third of the population of Europe. We know how horrible the death toll was from these pandemics, but very few people are talking about how especially additionally horrific it was, how devastating it was in those times for people living with disabilities. Now, in this pandemic, it's different. As Shabbir was pointing out, we now have the technology to keep everyone connected. In fact, those very technologies that we rely on to stay connected, everything from the telephone to those Android tablets to the cameras we use, are all based the majority of them are based on assistive technologies. They were developed as ways to include people at the periphery and ended up benefiting everyone. So, but back in the time of the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague, those technologies didn't exist. Imagine how isolating it was to not even have a telephone to be able to know what's going on or communicate to people if you were self-isolating. However, we get to live in this remarkable time. You know, the internet society has been fighting the fight to create a stronger internet that includes everyone for 28 years. And it's no coincidence that in the last 3 decades, more people have been liberated through digital technology than all the wars and revolutions in the history of humanity. We're living in perhaps the 7,500th generation of humans. There are perhaps been 7,500 generations. And we happen to be living in the first generation where it's truly possible to include everyone. And now, here we are with this challenge of living through the first plague, the first pandemic, where it's truly possible to keep everyone connected. I'm proud to be a part of the Internet Society's move to make sure this happens. And I really believe we will come out of this stronger, more unified, and more inclusive than ever. But only because of people like us are going to step up. And because we can do it, Shabbir mentioned every technology is available. Because we can do it, we must, for the good of society and for humanity and the good of all. Does that answer your question, Shabbir?
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for this very precise, crisp, and very detailed analysis. And I'm sure people would have questions where they would find some time to ask their questions if they think that their question is very pressing, and if that is addressed to a very specific speaker, they can post it in the chat and our speakers would try to answer their question. And we will ensure that it is answered during the question answer session. We talked about the pandemic, we talked about disability, we talked about the need that no human life is less or more important than anyone else. All humans are equal, so that the life of the human beings are equal as well. David mentioned about web accessibility training, very kindly sponsored by the Internet Society in Pakistan. I would like Naveed Haq to talk about this training. Naveed Haq, ladies and gentlemen, is the director, regional director, infrastructure and connectivity of the Internet Society. He was the main man, rather he has been the main man behind a number of projects related to accessibility for persons with disabilities, particularly when it comes to Pakistan and in Asia Pacific as well. So Naveed, how have you find this experience of working with digital accessibility for persons with disabilities? One. My second question to you is that how would you rate the response by the governments on the accessibility?
Thank you, Shabbir. I hope everyone can hear me. Before I start, I would actually, since I'm the co-host as well, I'm looking into the chat and there is a question. Perhaps David, if you can answer it, and then I see someone also have another question for David. So I suggest, Shabbir, if it makes sense, to take the questions now, and then of course I can take my questions to answer. So I will quickly read this question, which is about the affordability part, David. So question says the biggest block to the access of assistive technologies is money. When one considers that 80% of those who are disabled live in countries where money is a rare commodity, particularly amongst the disabled, it is a problem that needs addressing. So can you tell us maybe about, are assistive technologies very expensive, or, you know, because that's also, I think it's a very valid question.
Yes.
Yes, Naveed, I'd be happy to answer that right now.
Yes, David, could you quickly make a comment, and then I have a couple of sentences to say on that topic as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Naveed. I think the question is from Olaf Mittelstadt. Olaf, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but please to make this argument because I welcome you to join me directly at some other time because I can get into much more examples of how we do the economics of making sure that creating a more accessibility society doesn't even cost less. For example, the face mask I was showing earlier, which I'm holding up to the camera again now, Cynthia, my partner, made it for me this week just using these online instructions that Sarah published. And if anyone needs the instructions, just email me and I will send them to you. But it's true, Olaf, that historically assistive technologies were very expensive. But one of the great breakthroughs is because so many assistive technologies have had their costs driven down. So, for example, this Android phone I'm holding up, it used to be I have a color deficit. It used to be if I wanted to know what color my shirt was for sure, I'd have to buy a $200 device and hold it against the cloth and tell me what color it is. Now I can get a $2 app on my Android that does the same thing. Or this device I'm holding up right now is something called the Lip Sync. This is a device which allows people with a mobility challenge to navigate websites that are designed according to WCAG standards. They can navigate or do anything on any website using this device. It's got a tip in it that allows you to use the movement of your lips as a mouse and then to blow as well to cause like a mouse click. Now, this device, things like this cost $10,000 just 10 years ago. This device is printed on a 3D printer with under $300 worth of parts. It's designed by an NGO here in Canada. And so for $300, someone can have technology. And so and there are people building them to cover the $300 part. So you can, using local parts, local labor, this entire amazing magic device can work. So aside from the payoffs I was mentioning with the accessible dividend, for example, when we put the census online in Canada and we made it accessible, it saved millions of dollars of people having to transcribe paper forms into a computer. It was done to save money first and to make things accessible second, is the truth. I've got way more examples, but from either end, Olaf, if we strategize it, we have to start with looking at it. We have to do it at the core, because if you just think of accessibility as an add-on at the end, it's way more expensive. But if you change the culture and you design inclusion in by default, you drive down costs in all kinds of areas. Over to you, Shabbir.
Uh, Thank you very much, David, for this very precise answer. I just have to say, after your very detailed answer, that cost while making any online event accessible should not be even considered. It should not be even questioned. Whatever is online, because things and events are different, very, very different in online world rather in the physical world. In physical world, nature takes its course, whereas the online world is being created, being prepared by us, by human beings, and whatever can be put online, it can be made accessible by any means. And cost should not be a question. I do understand that there are some certain considerations uh, to to uh, to societies which are less fortunate than some other societies. But if we start questioning cost, we will be sacrificing much more than the cost we would be saving. And this is my word on that. Certain people may disagree with me, but this is my personal opinion, and I stick to this opinion as well. Naveed, over to you.
Thanks, Shabbir. We got good answers to that. I'll quickly move to Brent because, David, we have another question for you by Trent Manuel. If I pronounce your name correctly, Brent, over to you. I'm going to unmute your microphone.
Naveed?
Yes, Shabbir.
I think we better not go down this route answering question in the middle. I think Judith could take questions and take stock of those questions. Some would be repeated, and I think we can answer these
Oh,
questions in the end,
that's no, that's
because
fine.
because
Yeah,
this
yeah,
way
I
this way
understand.
would be lengthening. Yes.
Because he said he precisely has a question for David, so I thought let's use David times in he since he is with us already. But anyhow, I understand. Okay, so Brent will take your question at the end, and now it's time for me to wear my other hat, which is the speaker hat. So I'm no longer the co-host. So first of all, thank you so much, everyone. It's good to see we have around 47 participants, which is great. We all understand that this is the time when everyone is on the internet, in life is running on the internet, yeah. And I also understand that a lot of us have these webinars and a lot of online events coming in, which is not easy to handle as well. But to answer what Shabir asked me, um, I would I would say I would like to share some points based on the work that we did from Internet Society platform in Asia Pacific with multiple countries. Um, from the government side, Shabir, since you asked me what was the response, uh, I would say that unfortunately, in many of the developing countries, digital divide has been discussed since years, and now, in fact, with this pandemic, digital divide again is on the surface. You know, I recall 10 years ago there was so much of discussion of digital divide, but then we moved to digital inclusion more. But now again we back to the digital divide discussion, where we are seeing that who are the people who are not even connected to internet, which is, as I said, the life is running on it. However, this digital divide discussion unfortunately didn't scope in the accessibility factor. They didn't scope in the factor that the person with disabilities are also a user category who can have access to technology and who can use these technologies, which actually is a bridge, is a platform to enable the inclusivity in a society. So that's one factor which I observe. The second one is that the infrastructure and the content, which were designed primarily at the local level, they were also not designed in a way that they should be accessible, or they should be compliance with technology and platform which can make them available for everyone. um, and these two factors actually have now make this very clear that there is a strong opportunity for the governments, especially in this time, uh, to see how they can revise their policies uh, in a way that the environment in a digital society is totally inclusive and there is no one who's left behind. I also experienced working in Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Pakistan in particularly, that the developers, those people who code in the websites, those people who design those applications. Now, again, I'm not talking about global platforms like Facebook or Google, because we know they all are inclusive. Yeah, they have all of those standards, and you can access, anyone can access Google or Facebook. I'm talking about the local solutions, because to me the internet is driven primarily by the local innovations. Internet is driven by the local infrastructure. So those developers, they have little or no idea about accessibility. You know, the discussions that we had during our work with this community, we came to a conclusion that many of them even don't know that they can actually design an accessible website. You know, this was something which was very surprising but alarming as well. So that's also a problem which we see, that the nursery, you know, where these developers are developed, where they learn this coding languages or design the software, or the software courses like software engineering, the universities, I mean to say, they are also not have taken serious consideration that they should teach their students about what is accessibility, how their applications, how their internet websites, or how their solutions on the internet online can be accessible. Because for us, again, societal and the cultural factor has been that the person with disabilities largely have been marginalized. We have more than 600 million person with disabilities in Asia Pacific. That's a huge number. Um, and most of the work that I have observed, again, in Asia Pacific, including Pakistan, has been more towards the the helping factor. We have not been able to echo that there is a business factor as well. Just imagine those few examples that David has shown us. These are products which are cheap, which can be, and that's this answers the affordability question as well. If we are able to create an environment where these products can be created locally, because there is a lot of innovation in Pakistan, at least I can say, why not? So a lot to be done. I would say this pandemic is an opportunity. Let's see on the positive side that this has realized us as as the humankind, that internet is something which can run your life. You can do anything, everything on the internet, and now everyone is doing everything actually on the internet. So why not those person who are hard of hearing, or who have a visual impairment or some other type of disabilities, why not they are able to do? And especially from the emergency response as well. I was thinking before this webinar, when I was thinking, how should I cover it, I was just considering those various websites by the government of Pakistan who are just up about the COVID-19 response, which is excellent. But then a question comes to my mind: are those websites accessible? I don't know, Shabbir, maybe lately you can check and tell me, because this just came into my mind that there is a response from the government, but is that response inclusive in a say that information which is critical, especially in this time when everyone is in a lockdown mode, everyone relies on internet. A person who's visually impaired, is that person able to read and communicate all of that information on the government emergency response websites or not? So again, I would end saying that the work we did in Pakistan made us learn a lot. Lately, we did a lot of workshops. We were able to make some policy changes as well, which is excellent. But there's a huge room to work more, not only in Pakistan, in a lot of countries, especially in South Asia, I would say, because this is a common factor in a lot of South Asian. We are a huge population, and a huge population of persons with disabilities as well. So let's take it as an opportunity. And I would say webinars like these are kind of messenger or advocators, can online advocators, yeah, that can perhaps help us to take steps forward to make an inclusive society using that technology. And as we say at Internet Society, internet is for everyone. Back to you, Shabbir.
Thank you very much, Naveed, for this enlightening talk. And I'm happy that you took the time that you were allotted, 5 minutes. So thank you very much for being precise and crisp. Yes, it is very important that governments do their part to make digital environments, digital spaces accessible. But at the same time, it's also important that the drivers or the creators or the makers of those spaces, the developers and the other civil societies, organizations, they also do their part. It would not just be the part or the responsibility of governments that can make these environments accessible for everyone. Uh, our next speaker is a lady, and she has a very vast experience of working with digital accessibility for persons with disabilities, rather over 25 years of working with that. She is very well known. She needs no introduction. Gunela Astbrink. She is currently MAG member of IGF. She is also the vice president of Internet Society Accessibility Special Interest Group. Gunela, I know you have a very wonderful experience and much more to share with our participants. But what I would like to uh, ask you in this webinar is that how do you feel that how persons with disabilities and digital spaces are being treated in your part of the world? When I say your part, I mean the Australia and the Asia Pacifics.
Thank you very much, Naveed, and thank you, Naveed. Goodness me, I was listening to Naveed before. Thank you very much, Shabbir, for the introduction, and I'm delighted to be part of this webinar. I'm going to speak fairly slowly to give the sign language interpreters a chance to be able to interpret what is being said. Now, we know with COVID-19 that information and communication has all moved online. And it's more important than ever that all persons with disability has equal access to that information and communication. So we all know about the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. There's 181 governments that have signed the UN CRPD, as we call it, but are they really doing enough? And that's where rhetoric isn't meeting reality. So I'm going to cascade down from the international to the local level and talk a little bit about the Australian experience. So, of course, the UN CRPD is a key policy instrument that Australia has signed and ratified, and Article 9 refers to ICT accessibility. Now, Australia is a federation of states and territories, and it has its own quite strong jurisdictions. And one unique thing now with COVID-19 is that the borders between quite a few of the states have been closed from each other. And so that is an example of how the states works. So the states have their own disability legislation. And I live in the state of New South Wales in Australia, and there is the Disability Inclusion Act. Now, all New South Wales government departments, government agencies, and all local government councils are required to produce disability inclusion action plans. So this is where we're talking about policy. Is it really meeting the reality? So I will use a case study close to home in a small local government area of 35,000 people called Byron Shire to illustrate how in this area it works well. That doesn't mean it's working well in other areas. Now, the Byron Shire Council has developed its own disability inclusion action plan with ongoing input from the Access Consultative Working Group, comprising people with disability from the local community, and I'm one of those. So, in fact, the working group has advocated for many accessibility measures, including making the council website accessible, because this is where the community gets information about what's happening locally. And I'm happy to say that the website is more or less accessible, but it needs constant monitoring. Fortunately, the council, when they hire a new web developer, that web developer needs to be familiar with WCAG 2.1, as in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1. Currently, accessible online document management is being developed by a web developer in the council, so that when new documents come online, they are accessible from the start, rather than having to be retrofitted, which is often the problem. So how have some of these accessibility measures been achieved? Well, council section leaders get direct advice from persons with disability at working group meetings. Some breakthroughs includes setting up an internal staff access group to embed accessibility in everyday work. This is led by a staff accessibility champion. Online awareness training on disability is being introduced. So all of these factors together make a difference. The council is putting in place a more inclusive employment practice, incorporating processes that welcome applications from persons with disability. And obviously, getting a job is a key part of social inclusion, and certainly accessibility to the digital workplace is vital. So the sense is that if more people with disability are part of the workforce, this broader understanding can develop about people with disability and accessibility. And this type of approach, what I've just outlined, can be done in many, many organizations. Some of this has been discussed with the Internet Society. Now, in Australia, there's a saying, from little things, big things grow. And it's usually a symbol like this that's used. If the approach can work in one small community, it can be replicated in many other local, regional, and national governments. The right ingredients need to be in place. That's policy, practice, and people. This is where rhetoric meets policy. And how does digital accessibility come down to this? Well, people. So using policies and legislative instruments is one thing. We need them, but it has to be more than ticking boxes. Once people understand why this digital accessibility is important, through direct contact with people with disability, there's a greater incentive to make a change. For example, if a content development team included a blind person who uses screen reading software and speech output, they wouldn't forget to include, for example, an alt tag in a description of an image on a website. So I'll just finish off quickly by saying, okay, what needs to be done? We need to ensure that policy is put into practice. We need more disability awareness training. An example in Australia is that the federal government developed a contact tracing app called COVID Safe. And while the government had to be reminded of its accessibility obligations, they followed through. But that app does not work on older phones. And many people with disabilities can't afford the newer phones. So it might not be usable by all people with disability. Now, our disability voice must be heard and respected, and that's ongoing. New issues arise and have to be dealt with. And finally, it comes back to understanding why digital accessibility is vitally important to everyone during these times of COVID-19. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gunela, for this very knowledgeable intervention. And I do apologize for speaking very fast. I understand that I've been speaking a bit fast. I'll try to speak a bit slow. So before we move forward to our next speaker and ask them our question, I would like to ask our technical expert Judy that we had a small poll for the participants about the accessibility of this event. I, as a president of Accessibility SIG, would like to have this disclaimer that no one event is perfect, and we do understand that there would be certain mistakes. So we would like you as a participants to give us the feedback so that we can make our upcoming events more accessible for and more inclusive for everyone. Judy, do we have that poll? Can we put those questions to our participants so that we can have some answers? Okay. Meanwhile, but you collect those questions, I would ask our next speaker, which is Fernando Botelho from Brazil. And Fernando is visually impaired. I would like to, and he's associated with F100 123 initiative in Brazil. I would like to ask Fernando, as a visually impaired, how you have found the accessibility for person with disabilities in your part of the world, that how governments deal with the accessibility and how civil society deals with it. What is your experience? I would like you to share some of your personal experience if you can.
Sure. Thank you very much for the chance to be here. I can definitely share a little bit with you. As some of you know, I am based in Brazil, and I've been involved in assistive technology for in a very direct way for about 12 to 13 years, but even before that, just because I am blind. So in Brazil, we have a situation that I think happens in a lot of other places, in a lot of other countries from what I have observed, which is that we have absolutely remarkable and amazing laws that do not get implemented in quite such an effective manner. So our country signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We've been exemplary in many aspects of legislation. However, if we look at my experience as a blind person, if we look at the experience of the people I know, friends and so forth, if we look at reports from international agencies, if we look at W3C reports, and if you look at surveys, which I did throughout the project that we call F123, we realized that there's still a lot of problems in web accessibility in Brazil. And that includes every sector of society, specifically, or most importantly, I should say, it includes government websites, it includes educational websites, and it includes e-commerce. So as previous speakers have said, it's really a consequence of policy that sometimes is not converted into practice, and that is often done ineffectively because of the lack of the involvement of people. So that's a wonderful triangle of requirements that Gunela helped to share with us. But I think it's more than that. I think when you see these difficulties, they really tell you a lot more about the priorities of any particular society than they do about the technical challenges that they symbolize. Because technically, yes, there are a few challenges that are a little more substantial than others, but in general, the main problem we face is not a technical one, it's one of priority. When society is strongly against the behavior, it puts people in jail for it. If society is against the behavior, but it's not quite serious, it fines them. They get to pay fines for the infraction that they committed. And I'm talking either individuals or businesses, of course. And then when a society thinks something is nice, but not a requirement, then it just suggests that they do this or that. It does not fine them. So the approach that has been adopted by a lot of activists in Brazil is that we should educate. And I absolutely agree with that. I strongly support that. However, this is a requirement, but it's not sufficient. If you do not fine people for infractions, they will keep on doing them. And yes, we can certainly argue that we can educate people more. And let me mention a few of the suggestions. For example, people should have accessibility included in curricula in university and all kinds of courses involving content, involving technology. And that's absolutely wonderful. I think they should. And people are calling for that here in Brazil. They should have this as criteria when they need to approve a budget for an event, a government event or otherwise. There should be accessibility in that budget. That should be a requirement. I agree with that. But is it sufficient? For how many years are we going to focus exclusively on educating and not have any fines for infractions? So that's what I call, charity. If you're supposed to do something or you should do something, but there's no hard requirement behind it, if it's voluntary, that's charity. If it's really a right, there should be some enforcement of that right. Because if it's a right, it's important. If it's important, society should require it in a firm manner. So I think we either have to stop calling accessibility a right, or we should start treating it as a right. Yeah, so I think that's basically what I have to say. I think there have been advances in the last decade. We can certainly point to improvements in government websites, for example, but there's still a lot to do. It's still not working for most people in most websites. And these are not just entertainment websites or just social media where you're just chatting with friends. I'm talking about university access, distance learning. I'm talking about accessing important government documents which you might need. So these are not secondary needs. These are very much at the core of people's rights.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for this very enlightening talk. I do understand that there are some difficulties in ASL language interpreter. As it has been mentioned in the chat that this is a learning experience for us, and we are thankful for the participants to highlight this issue for us. It was a challenge for us to organize a sign language interpretation, but we, by any means, apologize undoubtedly for this inconvenience. Uh, Judy Okite is one of our speakers. She is from Kenya, and she is the founder of the Association for Accessibility and Equality. Judy, there has been a question in the beginning. I would also like you, in addition to talking about accessibility for persons with disabilities in your region, I would also like you uh, to give your views on the devices and accessibility versus cost. So over to you. Judy?
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you, Shabbir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, Fernando. So good to see you.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Shabbir, and your entire team for allowing me to be part of this webinar. Indeed, listening to the previous speakers, the experiences are the same across the board. And I really love what Fernando has said, that it's either we make accessibility for persons with disability a right or not. And of course, that's where I wanted to begin with my discussion today. That it's unfortunate that you find in Africa that the persons with disability do not understand this right. And so when they get something done, it's almost like a favor. And so where we are coming from, or where I am coming from, we are starting with the persons with disability to engage them, to educate them about their rights, about what they must have, and not what they need to request for. Because as we talk about accessibility, it simply means that everything that every other person is able to access should also apply to them. And of course, we have talked about the UN CRPD, um, Africa as a continent also has signed, with only 6 countries that haven't signed to the convention. And so we should be able to see much difference as of where we are right now. Last week, the UN had a study, and it showed that 48% of the African continent countries have standards or guidelines regarding accessibility. Now, the things that are happening in Africa, or rather globally, is that being able to get this information is very difficult. So either there is no implementation, or either if there is implementation, then it is not being shared, then it's not being discussed, because to come across this information is becoming a bit of a toilsome. So I will talk a little bit about what's happening in Kenya. um, we have the ICT law 2019 that has a whole paragraph actually concerning accessibility. And just to be able to pick out just some of the very key issues that it talks about is that one of them is promote the design, production, and distribution of accessible ICT at an early stage. Now, unfortunately, when we talk about accessibility, or rather at my place of work, when we do our audits on accessibility, then just like Fernando has said, the web developers do not have accessibility in mind, simply because they will say this was not part of their curriculum. So you are telling us something new that we are supposed to be having. You find that the ICT website in itself is not accessible for persons with disability. The National Council for Persons with Disability organization that defends the persons with disability rights, their website in itself is not accessible. In short, what we have in paper and what we are having in implementation are two totally different things. When it comes to regarding what has been happening in the during the COVID-19, Kenya had the first case in March. And of course, there is a day-to-day update from the Ministry of Health. And so, of course, the first days, accessibility was not considered until we had to make some noise. And then after that, they would have a sign language interpreter. But since they have to be 1.5 meters apart, then it wasn't making sense, because, of course, the camera is going to zoom in to the speaker at the moment. But over time, they have improved. And so now it is up to the broadcasting house to ensure that when there is the live broadcast, then there is interpretation, there is the sign interpretation. And so that one we are grateful for. But what remains across the board is what is on paper and what is being implemented. I mean, it leaves a lot. It really leaves a lot um, to be talked about. And so my thoughts at the moment would be, how do we achieve this? Is we really do need a political will, because many of the things that we are doing, unless the legislatures are part of it, unless they buy into it and stop playing around with the lives of the persons with disability as a red card at the back of their pockets, that during when we are about to have an election, then they will make these things accessible. But once that is done, then we go back to where we are. And so political will and also regulatory goodwill, that the regulator will know what it is that they are supposed to do and do it unexclusively, beginning with the government in itself, because it already has it within the constitution that persons with disability must have access to every information in accessible format, be it in braille or in sign language, and the content online must also be accessible. And just to answer what you've asked about the costs, yes, disability has a cost. When it comes to the costs of the devices, of the assistive devices, of course, it's pretty high compared to when a person with no disability does not have to incur such a cost. For example, if you have to install JAWS on your computer, it will cost you, whereas the person that doesn't have a disability doesn't really need JAWS on their computer. So I hope I've answered you, Shabbir.
Thank you very much, Judy. You have highlighted some of the very key points that we wanted to discuss, particularly with regards to very unfortunate incidents where ICT websites and the very websites which are supposed to provide information to person with disabilities are not being accessible. In the favor of paucity of time, I would go to my new speaker. Peter Crosbie is from France. He is advocate for the autistic community, and he is very very passionate when it comes to the rights for the person with cognitive disabilities. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is an area which when it comes to digital rights and digital accessibility, I'm not sure, Peter, would you be able to kindly ponder on this question as well, that it seems that cognitive accessibility and disability is an area which is often neglected from the discourse. So could you elaborate on that question, that correct me if I'm wrong, that if my perception is right or wrong, and also tell us something about cognitive disabilities and how it is being tackled in France and in Europe.
Thanks, Shabbir. I just want to check. So, well, Shabbir summed me up, I think, so I can just move on. So I'll start with a personal observation, and it's this. In terms of accessibility, this Zoom call is about the limit of what I can cope with. In fact, I can only cope by turning the screen off and having what I want to say written out. Otherwise, it's just all too overwhelming and stressful for me. But not just for me. What we're doing now here would be inaccessible for many people with cognitive disabilities, at least without help. And it's the same for people with limited digital skills. And it seems to me that at some point, we need to have a discussion about what's going on here, because these new technologies are really reinforcing a digital divide and creating a kind of digital underclass. And in a kind of post-COVID world, to be honest, I can only see it getting worse. And one of the reasons I see it getting worse for people like me is because there's just very little understanding of what cognitive access is or how it works. Now, as an example, if we just stay with Zoom, they trumpet their work with accessibility. Now, great, that's fantastic, obviously. But here's what they have to say. Well, one of the things, but it's one of the main things. The accessibility team works to ensure that all releases are compatible with as many assistive technologies as possible. Assistive technologies, fantastic. But there's no mention anywhere on the Zoom site of what specific cognitive access measures they've incorporated. And it's not just Zoom. Pick a domain: employment, housing, health, education, personal finance. In every one of these, people are increasingly having to rely on ICT. And in every one of them, they're coming up against cognitive access barriers. And while this hits people with cognitive difficulties the hardest, it's not just limited to us. Everyone will have faced these barriers. They're probably, without realizing it, generally we just call poor cognitive access bad design. And it affects everyone, regardless of, for example, level of education. On my website, I mean, I'll put a thing in the chat in a minute. I've linked to an article entitled "An Interaction Designer Tries to Make a Bank Transfer." It took her 10 days, and even then it didn't work. The author of that article doesn't have a cognitive disability, but she does have a PhD. My site also includes this quote: "The needs of the largest disability group in our community, those with cognitive disabilities and learning difficulties, appear to have slipped through the cracks when it comes to website accessibility. We're failing too many people because cognitive access is and remains a largely unaddressed issue." Now, that's the case everywhere, and it's also the case here in France. As you know, of course, France is in the European Union, so we're covered by the 2016 EU Web Accessibility Directive. This requires public and government websites to be WCAG compliant by September this year. I mean, it's similar to, for example, Section 508 in the US. I think everyone can imagine what I'm talking about. However, in France, for a whole lot of reasons that are cultural, societal, and even linguistic, when it comes to disability and access, we lag behind, certainly behind the English-speaking world. For example, the American ADA Act dates from 1990. The French equivalent only came into force in 2005. Disability and everything that stems from it is something that France struggles with. So, for example, the social model of disability is poorly understood here, even rejected in some quarters. There's no field of disability studies in France. And because of that, the development of a discourse and a language around disability is largely absent. I mean, the cherry on the cake here is that in French, there's not even a word for disability. So needless to say, this has a real impact on digital accessibility. So while we have the laws, it's all fairly hit and miss, and access barriers are common. I mean, this reflects exactly what Judy was saying. In short, as with cognitive access, we still have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, for these very enlightening points. I do agree with you that these technologies, whereas they provide us opportunities, they pose us very quite a number of challenges as well. And the 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 purpose of discussions like this is to find the way out of those challenges. My next speaker is Lidia Best. She is the former vice president of the European Federation of Hard of Hearing. She is based in UK. Lidia, coming from UK, a developed country, and having experience of working with hard of hearing, how do you see? I do understand that on this call, on this webinar, there have been certain challenges, but how do you see these challenges being erased by the communities outside this webinar? Over to you, Lydia.
Thank you very much, Shabbir. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a great pleasure. And also thank you for Peter for giving a great introduction, because some of the things he spoke about relate also to people with hearing loss. How do I find this webinar? For myself, very well. I'm using actually stream text because using the closed caption option in the Zoom when everybody else is bringing up some chat messages, it overlaps. So it's better to ignore closed captioning opportunity in the Zoom, and for me it's better to watch on the separate device. But this is exactly the problem. Not everybody can have a separate device, for example. I also come from Poland. I was born in Poland and I am living now half of my life in UK. And I see big differences between what accessibility is like for me in UK and what accessibility is like in Poland. And what I have been observing and watching was, for example, looking at digital divide. Who is right now hit probably the hardest when we're looking at COVID-19? I think it's the older people. They are the ones who supposed to shield. We're supposed to shield them. Who are supposed to, who are most endangered, if we say, by the virus. And yet the accessibility for them is not really what one would think of. So, for example, if you think about the emergency responses by our governments, in all different countries, they mostly relate on telephone calls. So you can call them, you can find out more information, or they relate to just sending you to the website. Well, great. If those websites have a chat facilities, then perhaps yes, but it's going to be accessible to persons who are deaf and hard of hearing. Those websites also need to have access with the sign language interpretation for those who use sign language. But when you come to think about people who are older, and I am the chair of National Association of Deaf People, which has quite a big proportion of the members of older age. And many of them are not feeling comfortable with the new technologies, even having smartphones. They will not be using, for example, relay services, which some countries, including UK, have now in telecoms. They would wish to use something what is much more familiar to them. For example, USA is far ahead. So thank you very much, Peter, for mentioning this too. In terms of the telecom access to persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. They have a range of accessible ways of being contacted and being able to contact services. And this is something what needs to be brought into the UK as well as Europe. It's one of the most important points, I think, and that's the opening from David today, when he said COVID has got a bit of silver lining in what it is done. It pushed some of the conversation a little bit further than we were trying before. So for those who have a hearing loss, the whole discussion about masks, for example, has brought out the communication issues suddenly in the forefront, when previously we struggled sometimes to get the message across. Right now, this message is going very well across. And I think it's something what I never expected to happen, actually. So it's a really good thing to do. Now, one more thing I wanted to say is something I've heard previous speakers saying about costs, for example. So, cost of accessibility. So in the UK, we have Equality Act, which is pretty good, if you think, legislation, but it's not always strong enough. So what we see, and I think it's also part of a UNCRPD, when you read it through, there is discussion about risible adjustment. The question is, who decides what is risible? Who decides if my request is risible or not? And that decision is not really in our person with disabilities domain. It's often in the domain of the people who provide the accessibility or organize events and so on. So what I have noted recently, organizations which previously would have funds to make the events on-site events accessible are telling me that they cannot make the webinars accessible, they have no funds. And how can I then request to make sure that they are providing captioning when they say to me, we have no funds? And I think that's something serious is going on. While the legislation is happening in different countries, there has to be a financial mechanism which allows persons with disabilities to participate fully. That kind of mechanism is okay in UK if you are working. But if you're not working, or if you are working on voluntary basis with a charity, for example, then you will not be able to access any funds to allow you to actually bring your own, say, interpreter or captioner to support you in the events. This is possible, not fully, not so easily, but still is possible in some of the Scandinavian countries, something we cannot do in UK. So there are lots of different discrepancies going on. What I think also we need to look at audiovisual accessibility across Europe. Well, in UK, we have had some issues with BSL interpreter not being on the main BBC, for example, briefings. We do have them. And also we have live captioning. Whereas across Europe, and I've done recently a report for the International Telecommunication Union working meeting last week, what I have found, there are countries where hard of hearing people or deaf who do not use sign languages have no access to the information, to television briefings, because there are no live captions. And also, there is no repeated programs with captions. Then there is also issue for people who actually use sign language. They do get sign language interpretation, and yet the interpreter's size on the screen is unusable. They cannot even follow this because they cannot see the interpreter properly in the right sizing. So there are lots of issues going on, which COVID in some ways have invigorated and energized our community to really get our message across, but we are not being included all too often. Now, Shabbir, coming back to your question about how do I find the event in general, is I don't use sign language, so for me it's difficult to say if the interpreter, for example, for this meeting is very good or is not very good. But the colleagues who have come up who are actually using sign languages, both BSL or ASL, have been able to confirm that they didn't feel it adequate. And therefore, I think we need to work together to make sure that next time we can do better. It's all learning experience, and I'm sure we can make things much better for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for this very enlightening talk. Unfortunately, we are about to run out of our time. Jolly and captioners, can we go a little bit beyond our time? Can I ask captioners to go, say it's 6:23 until 6:45, 15 minutes extra? Captioners? Okay. So what we will do is I will exercise the moderator's right, and I will ask our participants to pose questions in the chat. And if you have questions specifically from a specific speaker, please do address them while our last speaker speaks, so that your questions can be answered. I'm really sorry about that. That we will not be able to hear your good voices, very beautiful voices, but in the paucity of time, we'll have to change our mode a bit. Without any further ado, I'd like to ask uh, Manique Gunaratne. She is from Sri Lanka. She is visually impaired and the manager of Specialized Training and Disability Resource Center. Monique, as a person with visual impairment and a lady with visual impairment coming from a developing country, how do you feel about digital accessibility rights, and how do you feel that your rights are being secured in your country and beyond?
Yes, good evening. Good evening to everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes, Manique.
All right, okay. Thank you for inviting me for this webinar. As I told you, thank you for including actually persons with disabilities, because we always say nothing about us without us. So to talk about how about our digital rights has been secured. The problems, the list is very long. So what I must say that most of our digital rights of persons with disabilities in digital accessibility, we are facing a lot of challenges. Rather than talking about these challenges, I must say what we should do to get together, and we should do so that people with disabilities will be included, so that the internet, the concept internet for all will be a reality. So in Sri Lanka, we face a lot of problems in digital accessibility. Uh, in Sri Lanka, we don't have a specific body to address these issues of digital accessibility. We have the Ministry of Digital Infrastructure, and we have the Information and Communication Technology Agency, ICTA, where they do for the services for digital accessibility. But when it's come to digital accessibility for people with disabilities, the issues that we have are not addressed. Why these are not addressed? Because no systematic mechanism to include people with disabilities in the decision making process, starting from policy level to downwards. People with disabilities are not included in the decision making body, and also to when in the committees or committees where they decide on accessibility for people with disability. This is very important, because we say nothing about us without us. We should be included. And also the websites, most of the government websites are not accessible for people with disabilities. Especially we have two local languages. So the government websites does not use the Unicode fonts, and most of them, they don't use the W3C guidelines on international web accessibility. So this is very important. So, and also when it comes to, we say internet for all, because during this COVID-19, lot of university students, school children, and people who are working, especially people with disabilities, they had to work from home, e-learning facilities, online facilities. So these people with disabilities, sometimes they didn't have the knowledge of using these latest technologies, and they didn't have how to the online facilities, especially the coverage of internet is very limited in Sri Lanka. For long years ago, when from our organization, the Employers Federation of Ceylon Specialized Training and Disability Resource Center, we train people with disabilities on digital access, IT, so that it's easy for them to work equally capable as people with non-disabilities in an organization, in the society, so that they will be included in the society. So I think these trainings were useful at this situation, because they knew their technology, they knew they had their IT skills to work from home, to communicate, and all the e-learning facilities. So through some organizations and from the very basic level, there are training programs and programs conducted to make it accessible. And also we do to give recommendations for web designers. We do access audits so that web designers are trained in digital accessibility. So when they develop websites, they will consider on this web accessibility. And also in Sri Lanka, there are a lot of people in the very grassroots level. So they don't have technology and also the knowledge on how to use this technology and how to use the internet and get the information they require. So through the Internet Society Sri Lanka chapter also, we have done several programs to train people with disabilities in digital accessibility, how to surf the internet and get the information they require. Because people with disabilities, they need this information and the knowledge, how to access websites, how to do, especially these were useful in this situation because everyone was working from home or lockdown situation. And also I must talk about little bit about women with disabilities, because they are the most marginalized groups, and sometimes women with disabilities, due to lack of education level, vocational training, and due to poverty, they are not included in most of the programs in the society. So now in a small way, we are trying to develop some apps, as app to give information for women with disabilities, because when women specific issues, information for them to get the information. Otherwise it's difficult for them. They don't have anybody to get the information and they don't have accessibility. So these are very important. And also everyone talked about the accessibility to websites to be accessible. The list is long. Since we are running out of time, I will not give all those details. So I think websites should be accessible, not only for vision impaired persons, screen readers. Sometimes you think only when it's vision impaired people, only screen reader users. No, there are low vision people who are using large font, audio and sign language, and simple text for people with learning disabilities. So, and there are so many guidelines to make the websites accessible. I will not list them now. So it's a proper, a proper mechanism should be there to implement digital accessibility, because we as organizations working for people with disabilities and the civil society, it's limited that what we can do. This should come from the very top level, policy level, include people with disabilities in the decision-making process so that we can tell what are the best suited things to make it accessible. I think if everyone get together, we can make digital accessibility with technology, so that the concept of internet for all will be a reality to make the right real of all people with disabilities in digital access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ganeek, for your valuable insights. Judith, do we have any questions from any of the speakers?
We are. If you could put your question in the chat. We don't really have time, unless they're very quick interventions. I know we had K Ramachan and we have another hand up too, but if a couple of people, okay, so Jerry Ellis has a question, a comment is, cost is not the same for every organization. For a nonprofit one, it's simply a cost, and the restricted funds make it difficult to provide access services. For commercial organizations, it is difficult to advance to show potential profits from accessibility, but research from the likes of Accenture is increasingly demonstrating that these profits are real. For governments and public bodies, exclusion costs more than inclusion. If a person with disability is not included in society, particularly employment, they are not paying tax and must be paid social welfare support. Once employed, the opposite is true. Thus, the savings are real and immediate. Thank you, Jerry, for this great comment. And I know Rhonda has her hand up. Is it possible you can put in the chat, or
could you be very quick, Rhonda, if you have any question or comments?
And then K Ramachan has had a hand up for about at least 30-40 minutes.
So Judith, I leave it to you that who would you like to give the mic first?
I'll give it to K Ramachandran, but if you could be really quick. I'm trying.
Jody, can you?
It's not letting me do it. Okay, so meanwhile, Rhonda put a question in the chat. She says, I am the new Internet Society's global head of training and e-learning. And I'm just wondering, for all speakers, if you could share some of the things that can be done to help training content more accessible for you online. So thank you, Rhonda, for that issue. We have a lot of suggestions. I know Shabbir has a ton of suggestions that others probably do. Exactly. We will table that and we'll make that another call because that is a lot. We have a lot to say on that issue. Brent asked a question early on. Let me get to it. Hold on.
Naveed, are you online?
Yeah, I am here.
You had a question for David in the initial. I'm sorry I had to cut you short, but you can see we are running against time. So if you still have that question, you can pose that to David.
Hey, so the question was actually someone wanted to ask a question, and I thought the person perhaps would like to speak about it, but then we went with the flow. So I'm trying to read the text. I couldn't see any.
Yeah, me neither. The biggest block.
It was early
on.
on.
One thing, Olaf posted a comment on it. It says the biggest block to the access of assistive technologies is money. When one considers that 80% of those who are disabled live in countries where money is a rare commodity, particularly amongst people with disabilities, is a problem that needs addressing.
This was answered, I guess, by David.
Yeah,
this was answered.
It was another question from Amuna, I believe. No.
I'm looking.
Yes, Jody.
No,
I can
we
see them.
cannot see them. Oh, here we are. Okay.
So, Jolly, for visually impaired, the
I
Zoom's
will.
results are not accessible, so someone
I
will
will
have to
read
read the
them.
results. Yes,
I will
Jolly.
read them. Okay, so the first question, if you're a person with disability, which impairment do you have? We have a majority of 40% said they were hard of hearing, and 6% said they had the physical impairment. As to the question of which accessibility feature we would like to see in the future, text 80% say text transcription, which is good, and only 20% say sign language. But we will try to do much better with sign language next time. It's kind of difficult in the US when all the universities are closed and it's difficult to call people and to get them. Dr. Govin asked, oh, thank you, Doc. We'd like to thank the organizers for this wonderful webinar. And he would next time he would like to talk about the Indian experience. And yes, we would love to have you on next time. And maybe we'll have you when we do the format for the Australian and Asian areas. And so that's what a good idea. We'll be saving the chat on this, and so that way we can come back and address any of these questions.
So Shabbir, actually there are comments people are appreciating, but yes, I also had a scan through all of the chat. I don't see any questions. So back to you.
Yes, and thanks Ruta for this webinar, and we are sorry the sign language interpreters were poor. We will do much better next time.
Thank you, everyone. Do we have any quick hand raised, Judith, so that we can? So still we have 5 minutes, so we can adjust a couple of people, I guess, for quick comments.
No. We can just go to concluding remarks, Shabbir, and that we can talk about the future. Shabbir, talk about our future list and what we're going to do in the future with the webinars.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today in this webinar, in this very enlightening talk. Frankly speaking, though I've been working with accessibility and person with disabilities for a long time, and I had a lot of things to learn from this webinar. I also have to thank my speakers who very diligently and very openly talk about their issues when they were coming on their terms. Some of them took a little bit of more time, but it happens. I do understand that 5 minutes were very less to put across your point, but thank you very much anyways for coming online and speaking to our audience. I also have to thank the participants for participating in this webinar and enlightening us about your questions, particularly about the inaccessibilities of this webinar. Thanks are also due to the captioners, to the sign language interpreters. We will do our best to make our next events accessible. This is actually a series of webinars, about 6 or 7 webinars, 6 to be coming up in the next 5 or 6 months. We will have first have a couple of seminars addressing the needs of so you would have seen that addressing the needs and requirements of every person with disability and bringing people from different regions in this webinar was very taxing, and it took a lot of time as well. So what we will do for the next time is that we will address each disability in different webinars. So for instance, we will have next webinar on accessibility for person with visual impairment. Then we will have a webinar on accessibility for person with hard of hearing. And then we would have, as Peter highlighted, for cognitive disabilities. That is a very interesting area because we need to find a balance, create a balance between the needs and requirements of different people with disabilities and making a truly inclusive and digital environment. So this is our aim to find a balance, that how we can find balance between different technologies, how we can find balance between different abilities and different requirements. Also, how we can find balance between different people with disabilities. For instance, people with hard of hearing and deaf would like to see captioning and sign language on the screen, whereas it would be difficult or taxing for people with cognitive disabilities. So we also need to find a balance in between where the accessibility technologies come across one another. So how do we create a balance among these technologies? So these are some of the challenges that we would address in the next webinars. We are also planning to hold a webinar for ISOC staff. I do understand there were some questions from ISOC staff as well, that how we can make e-learning platforms accessible. This is one of the subjects that I personally have raised for a very long time, since 2015 when I joined the Internet Society. So it's a blessing, and also it's a welcoming step that ISOC itself is coming towards us and asking questions about making the e-learning platforms and e-learning content of ISOC accessible for person with disabilities. So definitely we would do these webinars on these different subjects, and we will try to address the questions. And if you have any suggestions for different webinars or speakers, or how we can make our future events accessible for person with disabilities, do write to us on info@accessibilitysig.org. We also have the website accessibilitysig.org. You can, if you are not a member of Accessibility SIG, you can become a member and join us in our cause to make internet accessible and inclusive for all. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, I thank you all for joining us today. I thank all of my technical team, all of ISOC staff who have helped us organize this webinar, our captioners, our sign language interpreters, my co-moderators. Thank you very much.